My wife told me she was holding my 102-year-old father's hand as he lay dying in the emergency room. I believed her completely. Until I heard a sound. It was the smooth chime of a luxury hotel elevator. At Hartford Hospital, the elevators were ancient steel boxes from 1957 that only made a dull ding-dong noise. I knew something was wrong. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. I'm Ethan Cross. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. I make my living as a systems engineer. My job is to find inconsistencies in computer code. I fix errors so everything runs on the correct path. I never imagined I would have to use those same skills to debug my own marriage. But when a single data point doesn't match, the entire system can collapse. That night, a blizzard raged across Connecticut. My car sped through the darkness. The clock read exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. My phone vibrated. The screen displayed the name Meredith, my wife. Her voice was choked with emotion. She said my father, Garrick, had just suffered a severe heart attack. She was crying. She told me she was at Hartford Hospital's emergency room. She said she was holding his frail hand tightly. My heart tightened. Garrick was a former federal judge. He was 102 years old. He was all I had left. I immediately pressed the accelerator and drove into the freezing night. I trusted Meredith without question. For the past 7 years she had been the perfect wife, a woman devoted to charitable work. But then a system error occurred. Over the phone, Meredith was sobbing as she described my father's condition. In between her cries there was a brief pause, and during that pause I heard it. A soft, elegant chime. Then a calm, digital female voice announced, "This is your floor." It was the sound of a modern Otis elevator, the kind found only in 5-star hotels. I froze. My mind immediately began processing the data. Hartford Hospital had been built in the middle of the last century. I had been there hundreds of times. Its elevators were rusting metal machines. They moved slowly and groaned with aging motors. They had never spoken with a polished digital voice. Meredith was lying. She was not beside my dying father. She was in some luxury hotel. I didn't rush to confront her. A good engineer never reaches a conclusion before gathering enough evidence. I kept my voice calm. I told her to stay where she was, and that I would be there soon. When the call ended, the space inside my car felt colder than the blizzard outside. A deep crack had officially appeared in the trust I had placed in my wife. A 7-year marriage had suddenly become a problem filled with gaps and contradictions, and I was going to uncover the truth behind the architecture of that betrayal. I pulled into Hartford Hospital's parking lot at 2:40 in the morning. Snow and wind lashed against my face, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice forming inside my chest. I ran straight to the 4th-floor emergency room 412. My father was there. He was unconscious. An oxygen mask covered his face, fogging slightly with each weak breath. Around him, the only sounds were the steady beeps of medical equipment. Meredith was nowhere to be found. There was no devoted wife sitting beside his bed like she had claimed. I stood there silently, staring at my father. Anger began to smolder in my chest. I walked to the nurse's station. The night shift nurse was Rayner. She looked up at me with tired eyes. I asked about my father's condition and who had brought him in. Nurse Rayner checked her notes and shook her head. She said my father had been transported from his home by ambulance. No family members had accompanied him. No one had signed any medical authorization forms. I asked directly about my wife. I showed her a photograph of Meredith. Nurse Rayner studied it carefully and suddenly remembered. She said that woman had come to the hospital. She pulled up the security camera records on her computer. The number that appeared on the screen made my blood boil. Meredith had been there for exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds. The hospital security system had recorded a complete behavioral log of her visit. Meredith entered room 412, wearing an expensive coat. She never checked on my father's condition. She never asked the nurses about his oxygen levels. The only thing she did was pull out the newest model iPhone. She adjusted her hair, stepped beside the bed of my unconscious father, raised her phone, and took a selfie. In the photo, she forced a sorrowful, grieving expression onto her face. Then she turned around and walked out. The entire visit lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. To Meredith, my 102-year-old dying father was not a family member who needed care. He was a prop. A perfect prop for building the image of a devoted daughter-in-law on social media. Betrayal was not an emotional impulse. For Meredith, it was a carefully programmed alibi. She needed that photograph to prove she had been at the hospital, creating a cover story for a much darker truth unfolding inside that luxury hotel elevator. Standing in the hospital hallway, I stared at the 6 minutes and 14 seconds displayed on the security monitor. I realized I had been living with a complete stranger, a monster hiding behind the image of a charitable wife, a woman supposedly known for her kindness. Meredith thought she had erased every trace of her deception, but she had forgotten one thing. I was a systems engineer. I no longer ran my life on blind trust. I ran it on cross-referenced data. I returned to my car and drove back to our house. I needed my computer. I needed to connect every data point. If this marriage was software infected with malware, I was going to trace the code back to its source. I sat in front of the monitor in my dark office. I began comparing my business travel schedule from the past year with the schedule of Meredith's charity board meetings. Meredith frequently claimed she had unexpected evening meetings. She said she was dedicating herself to the foundation. But when I entered the timestamps into an Excel function and filtered the data, a horrifying result appeared. Out of the 17 times I had traveled out of town, Meredith had reported an evening meeting exactly 17 times. The match rate was 100%. There was not a single deviation. This was not coincidence. This was a meticulously designed plan. I continued by reviewing our joint bank account. Charges from upscale establishments in New Haven began appearing on the screen. Zinc, the Elliott Hotel. The transaction times matched perfectly with the nights I had been away. Meredith had used our own money to pay for those nights of deception. But that was not the biggest flaw in her architecture of lies. Meredith was smart. She always deleted her messages and call history before coming home. She believed no one could catch her. But she had made a fatal mistake common among people who didn't understand technology. She had forgotten about the old MacBook sitting in our storage room. That computer was still automatically syncing data through our shared iCloud account. I walked downstairs to the storage room, brushed a thick layer of dust off the old MacBook and powered it on. The system began downloading Meredith's messages in real time. The screen lit up, and the first lines that appeared made my breath catch in my throat. The blue glow from the old MacBook illuminated my face inside the dark storage room. Messages continued downloading one after another. They appeared like a diary documenting moral decay. Every line, every timestamp, everything was displayed with perfect clarity. The person my wife had been communicating with was saved under a single letter L. I started reading the most recent messages. At first they were filled with flirtation and sweet words, but the further back I scrolled, the harder my heart pounded. This was not merely an affair driven by desire. This was a layered plan, a coordinated conspiracy. The man behind that single letter was Logan Pierce, a major financial partner of the charitable foundation Meredith managed. Meredith always prided herself on being careful. She meticulously erased every trace from the iPhone she carried everywhere. But she had forgotten about Apple's backup architecture. She knew nothing about the metadata of deception. A phone could be empty. The original data could still exist in the cloud. And it had just synchronized perfectly onto this old computer. The messages between Meredith and Logan Pierce exposed a disgusting truth. They referred to Garrick, my elderly father, lying in that hospital bed as an obstacle. One message from Logan read, "How much longer can the old man hold on? The foundation transfer paperwork has to be completed before he dies." Meredith replied, "I already stopped by the hospital and created my alibi. My idiot husband is racing over there. Everything is going according to plan. The $8.4 million from the foundation will belong to us." I clenched my fists so tightly that my knuckles cracked. Rage surged through me until it became difficult to breathe. The woman I had loved, the woman my father had treated like a daughter, she was waiting for his death. Day after day, she and her lover were plotting to steal the $8.4 million my father had spent a lifetime building for a children's charity foundation. They had calculated my every move. They had laughed at my trust. They had turned my loyalty and devotion into tools for their greed. I sat alone in the darkness of the storage room for an hour. I did not cry. Tears had no value in a system that had already failed. The circuit board needed to be cleaned. I inserted a USB drive and copied every conversation photograph and transfer record between Meredith and Logan. These would become the first lines of code used to destroy the architecture of their lies. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I decided to return to Hartford Hospital. I could not allow my father to lie there alone among predators. As I walked down the quiet fourth-floor hallway, I noticed another anomaly. A stranger was sitting outside room 412. He wore a cheap suit. A paper coffee cup rested in his hand. His eyes constantly darted around with nervous energy. Hospitals at dawn were nearly empty. His presence looked like a foreign command suddenly appearing inside a running program. I approached quietly, carefully. I stopped directly behind him. On his phone screen was a text message from an unsaved number. The message contained only a few words. "Has Ethan arrived yet? Just keep acting." I recognized the sending number immediately. It was Meredith's phone number. My body froze once again. Meredith had not only abandoned my father, she had planted someone outside his hospital room. I stepped forward and placed my cold hand on the stranger's shoulder. He jumped violently and nearly spilled his coffee. His head snapped upward. Fear and confusion filled his eyes. I stared directly at him. My voice was low, sharp as a razor. "How much is Meredith paying you to sit here?" The stranger looked at me. His lips moved, but no words came out. He tried to stand and run. I immediately shoved him back down into the plastic chair with one hand. The force of my grip made it clear that he had nowhere to go. I repeated the question, one word at a time, cold and precise. "How much is Meredith paying you to sit here?" He swallowed hard. His face turned pale beneath the fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway. He stammered that his name was Marcus Boyd. He was just an unemployed freelance actor. Meredith had found him through a recruiting website. Marcus Boyd admitted that my wife was paying him exactly $300 a day. His assignment was simple yet disgusting. He was supposed to wear a suit, sit outside room 412, and remain there. He was to pretend to be a concerned family member, constantly asking nurses and doctors about Garrick's condition. Meredith wanted to create a simulation of devotion. She had used money to purchase a substitute for genuine family affection. The goal was to convince the staff at Hartford Hospital that someone from the family was always beside the 102-year-old man. This was betrayal executed as a system, a calculation so cold that it was inhuman. She used my money to hire someone to perform a role while she herself was in Logan Pierce's arms. I looked at Marcus Boyd, feeling disgust rise into my throat. The wife who had shared my bed for 7 years had designed a pathetic performance like this in the very place where my father was approaching death. I demanded his phone. Trembling, he handed it over. I photographed the entire message history and call log between him and Meredith. Then I told Marcus that the performance was over. I ordered him to gather his belongings and leave the hospital immediately unless he wanted me to call the police for fraud. The paid actor did not dare argue. He grabbed his bag and hurried down the stairwell. I entered room 412. My father was still there, breathing weakly. I sat beside the bed and took hold of his thin hand, covered with marks from IV needles. At that moment I realized I could not remain on the defensive. I had to remove the malware at its source. The evidence of the affair and the hired actor was only one corner of a much larger iceberg. I needed to understand why Meredith was so desperate to seize the charity fund worth $8.4 million. I returned to the nurse's station to complete the medical authorization paperwork for my father that Meredith had deliberately ignored. While I was there, I overheard the broken sobs of a middle-aged woman in the waiting room across the hall. She was clutching a stack of medical records. Her face was hollow with exhaustion and despair. Her name was Clara Higgins. I approached and asked whether there was anything I could do to help. When Clara looked up and opened the folder, I saw a familiar name on the heading of a financial settlement document. Meredith Cross. The signature appeared beneath the title of President of the International Charitable Foundation. Clara explained through tears that her daughter Natalie Higgins, only 13 years old, had been admitted to the psychiatric emergency unit earlier that night. Natalie had been bullied so viciously at school that she had fallen into severe depression and had refused to eat for 2 weeks. I asked Clara why Meredith's foundation was involved. Her answer completely shattered my understanding of the world. My wife's cruelty had gone far beyond anything I could have imagined. Clara produced a confidentiality agreement bearing Meredith's signature. My wife's foundation had recently received a special donation worth $1.5 million from a billionaire named Preston Sterling. He was the father of the child who had led the group responsible for bullying Natalie. The $1.5 million was not a charitable donation. It was hush money. Meredith had used the foundation's influence to force Clara's family to sign a withdrawal agreement and completely bury the bullying scandal in order to protect the image of a major charity gala scheduled for the following week. Some people put children first. Others put gala events first. The distance between those two choices is corruption. My wife had pocketed $1.5 million to bury the future of a 13-year-old child who was fighting for her life in the emergency unit. I held the agreement in my hands. My fingers gripped the edges of the paper so tightly that they trembled. At that exact moment, my phone received an automated email from the security system at my father's home office. Meredith had just remotely logged into Garrick's computer. A command to erase all data had been activated on the core storage system of the former federal judge. I stood frozen in the hallway of Hartford Hospital, staring at the notification on my phone screen. The remote data wipe command was still running on my father's computer. Meredith was rushing to destroy the core files of a former federal judge. She wanted to erase every legal obstacle before Garrick closed his eyes forever. She wanted a clear path to seize the entire $8.4 million belonging to the foundation. I said goodbye to Clara Higgins. I promised her that I would find justice for Natalie. Then I rushed back to my car and sped toward home. My mind was operating at full capacity. My anger had transformed into a cold, focused source of energy. I no longer saw Meredith as my wife. She was a malicious virus destroying a system, and it was my job to isolate that virus. I arrived home at 6:15 in the morning. The house was completely empty. Meredith still had not returned from her night at the luxury hotel in New Haven with her lover. I walked directly into my office and locked the door behind me. I closed the curtains and switched on the high-powered desk lamp. Then I pulled out a large roll of drafting paper and secured it to the central wall. I uncapped 3 markers of different colors: black, red, blue. It was time to debug the entire architecture of this deception. I began drawing. Black represented the truth, the data logs that could not be disputed. I marked the time the ambulance transported my father. I marked the 6 minutes and 14 seconds Meredith spent taking her selfie at the hospital. I recorded the identity of the stand-in actor Marcus Boyd. Next, I used the red marker for Meredith's lies, the fake board meetings, the tearful phone calls during the snowstorm. Finally, the blue marker represented the hidden flow of money. I connected Meredith's receipts from Zinc and the Elliott Hotel to Logan Pierce's schedule. I mapped the path of the $1.5 million in hush money from Preston Sterling into my wife's private accounts. Meredith's moral corruption emerged clearly as a tangled diagram covering the wall of my office. It was a network of greed, cruelty, and deception. I sank into my chair and stared at the point where all 3 colors intersected. That was when I discovered a horrifying detail. The command to erase my father's data had been activated exactly 24 minutes before the hospital called to inform me about his heart attack. What did that mean? Meredith had known about my father's medical emergency before the doctors discovered it. She had been the first person to arrive at his house. But instead of immediately calling an ambulance to save his life, her first action had been to sit down at his desk. She logged into the system and activated the data wipe in order to seize the foundation's $8.4 million. She had deliberately delayed seeking help. She had already prepared herself for my father's death and hoped for it, so her scheme could proceed flawlessly. My blood felt as though it were boiling. This was no longer an ordinary affair or an embezzlement case. This was a cold-blooded crime. Meredith was willing to trade the life of the man who had welcomed her into his family for wealth and prestige. She intended to use that blood-stained money to shine at her upcoming charity gala. I looked up at the wall of truth. My investigation diagram was complete. I gathered every audio recording, every iCloud record, Marcus Boyd's statement, and Natalie's files onto a secure hard drive. I was not going to send them to the police yet. I was not going to allow Meredith to be arrested quietly. I was going to destroy her in the very place where she believed she was most powerful. I picked up my phone and called someone Meredith would never expect. The person on the other end answered, sounding surprised. I spoke only a single sentence. I have Meredith Cross's original data. Do you want to help me bring her down? The person on the other end of the line was Logan Pierce, my wife's lover. He froze when he heard my voice. The 5 seconds of silence that followed told me he was panicking. I did not give him time to invent an explanation. I recited the exact metadata from his 3 o'clock morning message stored in iCloud. I read aloud the hidden account number he had been using to receive money from the foundation. Logan collapsed immediately. He realized that the entire architecture of deception he had built with Meredith had been exposed. I gave him an ultimatum. Either he would testify against Meredith at the upcoming board meeting, or I would send every data log and file to the IRS and federal investigators. Logan was a seasoned financial operator. He understood the balance of risk and reward. He immediately chose to save himself and agreed to betray Meredith. Next, I contacted Savannah, the person responsible for organizing the Foundation's charity gala series. I sent her Natalie Higgins's medical records and the $1.5 million cover-up agreement. Savannah was a person with a conscience. She broke down crying on the phone when she learned the disgusting truth behind Preston Sterling's donation. She agreed to help me set the perfect trap. 2 days later, the special board meeting took place on the eve of the gala. Meredith entered the conference room wearing an expensive designer suit, her face glowing with confidence and authority. She had no idea that her system had already been infected from within. She sat down in the chairperson's seat and greeted the board members with a smile. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, I pushed open the door and walked in. My appearance caused Meredith to hesitate for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure and asked what I was doing there when my father was still in the hospital. I did not answer with emotion. I walked to the head of the conference table and plugged my USB drive into the central projection system. The large screen lit up, not with the Foundation's financial reports, but with my 3-color investigation diagram. The image of Meredith taking a selfie during her 6 minutes and 14 seconds beside my father's hospital bed appeared on the screen. The recorded testimony of the hired actor Marcus Boyd echoed throughout the room. The $1.5 million cover-up agreement involving Natalie was enlarged and displayed for everyone to see. Meredith jumped to her feet. The color drained completely from her face. She stammered that I was slandering her. At that exact moment, Logan Pierce entered through the rear door. He did not look at Meredith. He walked straight to the table and handed over all of the hidden financial backup records to the board members. Savannah also stood up and announced that Meredith's authority over the gala had been revoked. The entire board was stunned. Outrage erupted throughout the room. They immediately voted to suspend Meredith from all positions pending a legal investigation. Meredith collapsed back into her chair. Power, prestige, and expensive clothing could no longer save her. Her system had completely crashed. She had been destroyed by the very things she worshipped. If you have followed the story this far, then it has probably given you some strong emotions. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you made it this far, and predict how you think the story will end to see if you are right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving Meredith alone in the silence of humiliation. But my fight was not over. Just as I stepped into the building lobby, my phone vibrated. The call was from Hartford Hospital. On the other end was the chief emergency physician. He told me something about my 102-year-old father that nearly stopped my heart. The chief physician's voice came through the phone, trembling with astonishment. He said that my father, former federal judge Garrick Cross, had miraculously regained consciousness. It was a final burst of clarity before death. The mind of a 102-year-old man had suddenly become sharp again as if by a miracle. He had requested to see Meredith and me immediately. I returned to the conference room at once. Meredith was still sitting there in a daze, surrounded by the contemptuous stares of the board members. I looked at her and spoke coldly. "Father is awake, and he wants to see us." The moment she heard the word awake, Meredith flinched. Pure fear appeared in her eyes. She knew exactly what she had done on his computer before calling for emergency assistance. She understood that if Garrick was lucid, all of her crimes could be exposed under the light of the law. But she had no choice. Her survival instinct forced her to come with me to the hospital, in search of some way to save herself. We entered room 412 at Hartford Hospital. My father had been taken off the oxygen mask. He was sitting upright against the headboard, his eyes as sharp as they had been during his years on the federal bench. It was as if the power of justice itself was giving him strength during the final moments of his life. Meredith immediately rushed to his bedside. She dropped to her knees and forced out tears. She cried that she had been framed and begged him to trust her. She performed the role of the pitiful daughter-in-law once again, just as she had done for 7 years. But Garrick did not look at Meredith. He looked only at me. Then he slowly raised his frail hand. He pressed the button on a small recorder resting beside his bed. It was a standalone recording device with no network connection, the one thing Meredith had overlooked when she initiated the remote data wipe. The recorder crackled softly. Then a voice emerged that left Meredith completely frozen. It was the voice of Meredith herself, along with Logan Pierce inside my father's office on the night he suffered his heart attack. In the recording, Meredith said, "The old man has passed out. Let me delete the electronic will files first, then I'll call an ambulance. He's 102 years old anyway. If he dies now, that's perfectly reasonable." It turned out that my father had suspected Meredith long before this. He had installed a secret mechanical recording system in his office. The device recorded sound directly onto physical media, a system that could not be hacked or erased remotely. Meredith had personally recorded the evidence of her own crime. Garrick switched off the recorder. He looked at Meredith with the cold gaze of a supreme judge. His voice was low, but it echoed throughout the hospital room. "Meredith, you are no longer my daughter." My father then turned toward me. Standing beside him was the family attorney who had apparently been waiting there all along. Garrick announced that he was exercising the final authority of a former federal judge. He signed an emergency amendment to his will right there in his hospital bed. The new will stated that his entire estate of $8.4 million, along with the family's shared assets, would be transferred into a special trust. The trust would be jointly managed by Clara Higgins and me to fund treatment and protection for Natalie and other victims of school bullying. Meredith was completely disinherited. She would not receive a single cent from the Cross family. Meredith screamed in rage. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the will from the attorney's hands. But at that moment, the hospital room door swung open. 2 hospital security officers and 3 uniformed police officers entered. In their hands was an emergency arrest warrant approved directly by the federal prosecutor's office. But Meredith's punishment was not over. Just as the cold handcuffs closed around her wrists, my phone received another data notification. A confidential file had arrived from Logan Pierce's email account. It contained one final secret. A secret that could place Meredith under the most severe penalties available under federal law. The confidential file Logan Pierce sent was the final nail in the coffin of Meredith's reputation. It contained records of fraudulent tax filings connected to the charitable foundation over the previous 3 years. Meredith had been laundering money. She had worked with powerful figures behind the scenes, turning the foundation into a tax shelter for wealthy men like Preston Sterling. This was no longer a civil matter. It was a federal financial crime. Meredith was escorted down the halls of Hartford Hospital in handcuffs. The mechanical restraints tightened around her wrists. The pride of the powerful woman disappeared completely. Only panic and humiliation remained. Hospital staff and visitors gathered to watch. They whispered. They took photographs. The reputation she had spent years constructing officially collapsed beneath the weight of justice. Inside room 412, a strange sense of peace settled over everything. My father, Garrick Cross, looked at me and smiled. His eyes no longer carried the stern authority of a federal judge. Only the love of a father remained. He had completed the final mission of his life. He had protected his only son. He had protected the justice he had pursued for an entire lifetime. 1 hour after Meredith's arrest, my father closed his eyes for the last time. He passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no pain. There was no regret. The biological system of his body had completed a proud journey of 102 years. Just then, the hospital room door opened quietly. Clara Higgins entered holding Natalie's hand. Natalie still looked thin and fragile, but life had begun returning to her eyes. She walked over and handed me a small drawing she had made herself. It showed a blue sky without dark clouds. Natalie looked at me and thanked me. It was the gratitude of a child who had been rescued from the depths of depression. Looking at Natalie, I knew my father's $8.4 million had been placed exactly where it belonged. The new Garrick Cross Trust would protect Natalie and hundreds of other children. Justice is not only about punishing the guilty. Justice is also about healing the wounded. Meredith was held at the Hartford County Jail while awaiting trial. The IRS immediately froze all of her personal accounts. Properties held in her name were seized. Logan Pierce did not escape either. He was arrested at the airport while attempting to flee to the Bahamas. Preston Sterling's $1.5 million confidentiality agreement was voided. He was summoned for investigation on bribery and conspiracy charges. A week after my father's funeral, I sat alone in the empty boardroom of the charitable foundation. This had once been Meredith's temple of power. Now it was nothing more than an empty room. Everything had returned to equilibrium. The source code of deception had been completely removed. The system had been cleaned. Then I received a call from the family attorney. He informed me of a new development in Meredith's case. While detectives were sealing her private apartment in New Haven, they discovered a hidden safe concealed behind a portrait of her. Inside the safe were no jewels, no stacks of cash. Instead, they found a file bearing my name. The file had been created exactly 1 week before our wedding 7 years earlier. I opened the backup PDF the attorney sent to my email. As the first lines appeared on the screen, my entire body froze once again. Meredith had planned our marriage before we had ever met. I stared at the computer screen. The file from the secret safe was displayed clearly. Its title was Plan to Approach Ethan Cross. The creation date was May 14, 2019, exactly 1 week before Meredith had accidentally spilled coffee on my shirt at my regular cafe. The past 7 years had not been a coincidence of fate. They had been a pre-programmed project. Meredith had studied me carefully. She knew I was a single systems engineer with a high income. She knew my father was a former federal judge who controlled a substantial fortune. The file documented every one of my habits, my musical preferences, my psychological weaknesses. She pretended to be a kind-hearted woman in order to enter my life. She turned my love into a long-term financial instrument. A chill ran down my spine. The entire marriage had been malware planted from the very first day. I had spent 7 years living beside a professional emotional hacker. But Meredith had miscalculated one thing. She could program a perfect beginning, but she could not control the ending. No matter how sophisticated a system of lies may be, it always leaves traces. And when a system error appears, the old lines of code eventually return to destroy their creator. Meredith's trial arrived on a summer morning. She stepped into the courtroom wearing no expensive designer suits. Instead, she wore an orange prison uniform. Her face was gaunt and gray. The eyes that had once been filled with pride now contained only empty despair. Logan Pierce sat in the witness section with his head bowed. He had revealed every illegal money transfer involving Meredith in exchange for a lighter sentence. Clara Higgins and Natalie were also present in court. Natalie held her mother's hand tightly and looked at Meredith without fear. The girl's presence was living proof of the defendant's cruelty. I sat in the section reserved for victims. I did not look at Meredith with hatred. I looked at her with the detachment of an engineer watching defective software being deleted. The federal judge struck the gavel. The sentence was delivered with unmistakable finality. Meredith Cross was sentenced to 18 years in prison for fraud, federal tax violations, and conspiracy to commit extortion. All illegally obtained assets were confiscated to compensate the victims. Her personal bank accounts officially fell to zero. Meredith collapsed inside the defendant's enclosure. She looked toward me crying and begging for forgiveness. But security officers quickly escorted her away. Her cries grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared behind the heavy steel doors. The architecture of her deception had completely collapsed. The system had finally run according to its original code, justice. I walked out of the courthouse and into the sunlight. Everything had been cleaned. I returned to my home and sat in the old kitchen where everything had begun. The house was quiet. There were no more deceptive phone calls. Only the gentle sound of wind passing through the window. I opened my personal computer one last time. I looked at the 3-color diagram on the wall of my office. My mission was complete. The system of my life had been debugged. I pressed the power button and shut down the computer. The screen went dark. Just as I was about to stand up, the doorbell rang. A rapid, urgent ringing in the middle of the day. I walked to the door and opened it. Then I froze. Standing on the front steps was a stranger holding a black envelope. Written across the front were the words, "The truth about your mother's death in 2015. I stared at the black envelope in the messenger's hand. The person turned and walked away immediately, without offering a single explanation. The words were handwritten in smeared red ink, "The truth about your mother's death in 2015. An old data point had suddenly resurfaced. I had believed the system of my life had been completely debugged, but it turned out there was still a hidden partition buried deep in the past that had never been fully scanned. I closed the door. I walked into the living room and sat down on the leather sofa. My fingers slowly opened the envelope. Inside was an old SD memory card and an original forensic report from 2015. The report stated that my mother had died in a traffic accident caused by a loss of vehicle control. But when I turned the paper over, I saw an approval signature from the federal prosecutor's office. That signature belonged to Logan Pierce, Meredith's lover. I immediately inserted the memory card into my computer. Only one audio file appeared. I pressed play. A familiar voice filled the room. It was Meredith's voice from 11 years earlier, when she had still been a law student intern working under Logan Pierce. She was discussing with Logan how to approach the Cross family. The best way to push a federal judge into isolation was to take away his spouse. The accident in 2015 had not been random. It had been a deliberate act of brake system sabotage. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The truth is sometimes colder and more brutal than any piece of malicious code. Meredith had not merely planned to marry me for money. She and Logan had been involved in destroying my family for more than a decade. Their plan had operated smoothly for 11 years. But they had forgotten one thing. Data never truly disappears. It simply waits for someone with the right tools to recover it. I saved the file and sent it directly to the new federal prosecutor's office. Meredith's 18-year prison sentence would almost certainly be upgraded to life imprisonment. Justice may arrive late because of system latency, but it always runs according to its core source code. Looking back on the entire journey, I realized an expensive lesson. Never confuse trust with voluntary blindness. In life, we often choose to ignore small errors because they are familiar. We accept mismatched data points because we do not want to face an unpleasant truth. That blindness is the greatest security vulnerability of all. It allows liars to install malicious code into your life. Always keep a clear head. Learn to notice even the smallest inconsistencies. Do not run your life on vague emotions. Run it on verified facts and evidence. When you discover an error, have the courage to remove it immediately before your entire system is destroyed. Thank you for joining Dad's Real Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your story in the comments and subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lesson. See you in the next video. I stepped out onto the balcony. The summer wind blew strongly, completely clearing away the suffocating air of the past. My home was finally clean. The system of Ethan Cross's life had completed its debugging process. I was ready to write new lines of code for my own future.